that I was 24 hours out of it. So probably not the best thing to start with admitting, but I thought, full disclosure, that's where my headspace is at the moment. So if I start talking nonsense, that's why. So we're going to be talking to you today about data warehousing for schools. Just kind of give you a bit of background on how I got here. My role at GIS is I'm the innovation lead, so I kind of am involved with lots of things to do with using technology to improve teaching and learning across the school. But I kind of started to get a lot of work going on with data and analytics within the school. Kind of understanding my background is I'm a physics teacher, so I am kind of a numbers guy. And after a little while, I started to kind of get relegated to the data goblin in the corner, churning out lots and lots of spreadsheets and kind of had ad hoc analyses. And what we started to find was there was a lot of repetition going on and a lot of quite inefficient practice. So what I'm going to be talking to you today about is our attempt that we've done at our school of starting to solve that. I definitely don't pretend to be an expert on this, but hopefully what I can do is give you guys a bit of some food for thought to where you might go next in your journey at your school. So when we're thinking about data in schools, if you have any kind of responsibility for it, hopefully some of these things may resonate, or hopefully not. Hopefully you've already solved these issues and you don't have any of these problems in your context. But this is certainly something that we see a lot at GIS. What we do a lot of the time is things are dumped out of our MIS system. We currently use SIMS, although I'll talk to you a little bit about that in a minute because there's an interesting story there. Things get dumped out of SIMS, often into CSV files. Then people do their kind of ad hoc analyses in Excel or Google Sheets. And there's lots and lots of issues that we start to see with that. So for one thing, we often get people coming back and saying, this student is saying that they've got 15 A-star grades, but we only offer 8 subjects. So what's going on there? We see things where we've got lots of stale data and we run around and do lots of sort of chats with individual teachers and they say, oh, no, I just made a mistake. Actually, they're on this grade instead. We also see sometimes that we get stuck in the past. Someone's gone along and created something. Often they've put in beautiful visualizations, or maybe they've even gone so far as to use Google Apps scripts to make things that look really, really fancy. But that then means that now we're locked into our reporting system because, oh my goodness, if anyone changes the grading that we use, everything else is going to break downstream and everything's going to go wrong. And then we have the particularly international schools. I don't know, again, depending on your individual context, but we have lots of students that they have a national name and then they have a Western name. So I put in there, is C1 the same as Clive? Or he calls himself Clive on this. So he's on one spreadsheet, he's on as Clive. On something else, he's C1. How do we check? And there's a lot of things that start to rely on individual teachers' knowledge and understanding of our context. So with all that in mind, what we really realized was, okay, this isn't working for us. We need a more organized and more coherent structure. And that's where data warehousing comes in. So it's nothing new. It's been around since, well, at least 1997, when Ralph Kimball, who's kind of the undisputed king of data warehouses, came up with this. I quite like this as a phrase. A data warehouse is nothing more than the union of all data marts. And a lot of it comes from business, the business community. So we have a slightly intimidating looking diagram there. So what I'm going to try and do is just sort of explain that in a school's context. So we start off on the first sort of row, the first column, with our data sources. So typically in most schools, you'll have a student SIS system. So in our school, we use SIMS. You might have something like, we use Schools Buddy, that does our CCA program. And you may have, we certainly use Google Classroom. And then throughout the year, we also get static files. So at the end of the year, when we do our exams, all those results come in flat CSV files. So there's lots of these different sources of data. And then what we try to do is combine them all into one single place. And to use that, you use an ETL system or an extraction, transformation, and loading system. In our context, we are really simple, so we're using SQL Server integration services. I'm going to talk a little bit later. There are loads of probably much better solutions out there, but we were kind of, we worked on what we had and what we had knowledge of internally. And then you shove all of that together into one single data warehouse. Now, the idea of that data warehouse is this is nothing operational. This exists purely for people that need to make decisions based on that data. So you have your outputs from there, things like we use a lot of Power BI, but we also have colleagues that love Google Looker, RAP Studio, or you might go and even you can just extract that straight into Excel or any format if you can afford it, because their licenses are insanely expensive. Tableau is absolutely amazing, but last time I had a conversation with them, their prices were really, really high. I don't know if it's come down. For individual use, though, again, fantastic piece of software. Why is this a much better way of doing it? Well, the idea is you can set up so that your IT team or your kind of data infrastructure team, they maintain the data warehouse. So the people that are creating these reports, they never need to care about where that data is coming from. If you have good pipelines and good systems and structures in your school, everyone can use the data warehouse. Everything in there should be correct. And that means it's completely agnostic to changes in other systems. Right now, we're going through a process of looking at migrating our SIS system to something new. SIMS, as a lot of people are finding, it's not quite meeting our requirements anymore. So we're looking at a couple of other vendors. Now, in our very, very early versions, a lot of the reports that we made, we had lots of kind of custom CSVs and things that exported at night, and they all ran from SIMS. If we went away from SIMS, we would not, or all of that would be broken. With a data warehouse, all we have to do is change this part here that goes into the warehouse. Because all the reports come out of the warehouse, the people that are actually report authors, they don't see any changes at all. So nothing, in theory, should break. And that's what I keep trying to tell my principal and promise him. It's all going to be fine. It's all going to be fine. So there's a lot of advantages that you get from this. Actually creating the data warehouse is a good way of discovering if there are any flaws in your data collection and retention processes. In order to pull these things in, you really have to go back to your data architecture and say, well, where is the authoritative version of a student's name? Sounds really simple. But again, in our context, we have students that may have 4 or 5 different names. Which one's the forename? Which one's the surname? What's their name on their birth certificate? What's their name on their passport? And you can often use this to trace back potential issues that you may have in your school of who has I like to call it the single source of truth. Where's the actual correct version of this? Consistent conventions really simplifies the use of data conventions. So if you all know, everything in the warehouse is going to have the same format. Again, it makes it really, really easy for staff to go and create those reports because it has this consistent structure. And also for, like I said earlier, if there's a change to your source system, it doesn't affect your reports. So a lot of you might be thinking, well, hang on, this is just a database, or this is just a big table. So it's worth, again, just talking about this, especially if you're from a techie background, or if you're working with very technical people. And I've got a little just example here to sort of show the difference between this. This was something that might come out of your MIS system might look like. So you would have a primary key maybe in there for the student, and then you have foreign keys that link to different year groups. And if I've done this and I don't recommend it, it's a horrible experience, but we have done reverse engineering from the SIMS database. We host it on premises. It's not a fun experience trying to work out what things actually mean in there. So in a data warehouse, you completely flip the script and you make it so that it is completely readable to anyone that comes along and looks at that table. So in a typical database, you'd have another table of year groups, and that would then say primary key 338 has the friendly name year 10. In most data warehouses, you wouldn't bother doing that. You just put it directly in the table. And this is quite a big mindset shift because the first system is great for robots. It's very efficient. It reduces space, has lots and lots of advantages programmatically, but it's awful for humans. The second one is designed with people in mind, and it keeps your data consumers happy. There's also lots of little things in there, like naming your columns in there. We try to name them so that they're really intuitive. You can tell at a glance what they refer to. And that is, like I say, a really, really big mindset shift. So when I first started working on this, the typical way that it's described is computers love a snowflake model. This is a snowflake model on the left-hand side. So anytime you have something that's really being repeated, you'd move that out into a separate table. In a data warehouse, you tend to prefer a star model. So you only ever have a single jump to get to something else. And like I say, this is a real mindset shift. Certainly my senior developer that I'm really lucky to work with alongside, she's an absolutely outstanding coder. But I have to constantly go, no, you've normalized our data again. We have to go back and just put in the value. Yeah, it takes a bit more space. But we're only dealing with, say, 3,000 students. So if you've got 3,000 students writing in their actual name of a year group, no, James, you don't normalize the data. We don't normalize it. We want to denormalize it. And that's what I say. It breaks people that work in coding. It seems so unnatural. But once you start working with this, you see the advantages of doing it this way, because for your report authors, I don't want to go into a second table to look at year 10 and then go, okay, I only want this primary key 338. That's an extra step that you don't need. So like I say, that's the big mindset shift in warehousing, is you're moving from something that works well for computers into something that works well for humans. Let's say then that you're convincing that, yep, this is absolutely something that I'm super, super keen on and I want to get involved with. What are the steps to involved in doing that? So first thing I would encourage you to do is go and read up about it. I, again, definitely don't profess to be an expert at this, but we have done quite a bit of work on it, and a lot of it is based around, particularly this book, Ralph Kimball and Marguerite Ross's Data Warehouse Toolkit. It's a great book because it takes you through lots and lots of different case studies. So it starts off by introducing some common language, and I think having that common language is really, really useful in this kind of tool. You might see it, especially if you've used things like Power BI or Google Looker, they very clearly delineate data into dimensions or facts. This book does a great job of just describing what those mean, but then it gives you loads and loads and loads of case studies. Now, a lot of those case studies are based around businesses. So they start with retail and then they move on to sort of other areas of mostly US-based businesses. But they do give you lots and lots of examples of different ways of dealing with changing data. So I'd start by reading up on that. And then if we're thinking about forgotten the type of change modeling. It's just popped out of my head. That's really weird. But think about typical change modeling. You often want a powerful coalition of people involved in this. This is not a straightforward thing to do. So I've got a couple of prompt questions there on the right-hand side. Thinking about who controls each element of data. So it might be that admissions typically will control things like official dates of birth, names, things like that. You then may have an exams office. And again, I'd really encourage you to think about that single source of truth. If you have data, so a lot of the time data might be replicated into, for example, your MIS system. But if that data originally comes from somewhere else, it's really helpful to say, well, let's get this from source, because then you can cut out any potential mistakes that may happen as it gets translated from one system to another. So you need to start talking about those people. It's also a really good opportunity to talk to your data protection officer and think about, well, who needs access to this and how can we protect it as we go through this process. In Malaysia, we have the Personal Data Protection Act that we're working on quite a lot to be compliant with. And again, this type of model actually gives you a lot of opportunities, because you can go back and say, well, do you know what? We had lots of people having access to these sort of core systems where data was coming from. They don't really need that access. We can just give them access to our data warehouse. And lots of data warehouses will let you do things like have row-level security. So you can say, well, you're the head of primary. You don't really need to be able to see all the enrollment details for our secondary students. So in terms of being data protection compliant, you can solve yourself a lot of those headaches if your sort of source systems don't have that built into it. You can then think about who's making these dreaded spreadsheets. Who is it these people that often get tapped on the shoulder and asked, can you do this for me? They're going to love a data warehouse because it's going to really reduce their workload. They don't have to keep pulling out the same things time and time again. And then thinking about your IT team as well. So who actually has the infrastructure in place? When you've done that, and if you've read up about it and you know who you've got there, then it's time to start deciding on your tools. There are loads of different options out there. I would definitely say that in our case, we are pretty old school. We're going all on premises. We're using mostly Microsoft things. There are all singing, all dancing options out there that do way more than what we currently have. But because in that previous step, we know that we have staff on site that are really, really fluent in the Microsoft products. So for us, it made a lot more sense to stick with SQL Server integration services and SQL Server because we just know how that works. But there are loads of, like I say, much fancier things out there. So thinking about your team, thinking about what you have access to, thinking about cost, you can start to pick out the different tools that you want for each layer of your infrastructure. And then it's time to start writing your user stories. So I was around just to catch the sort of middle and end of Georgina's work, and I use a lot of that as well. So when she was talking about user stories and scrums and agile development, that's what we use as well. So I often start with these user stories, and I go around and interview and chat to the different people that are our consumers of data. So these are some typical ones that we might have, and I've tried to sort of split them into different users throughout the school. And this is another example of why data warehousing is often a really good way of doing this, because you don't have to just stick to one particular thing. So head of year may be interested in behavior points and the academic grades, but you can bring in other sources as well that aren't student-centered. So you could, for instance, bring in your staff salary information, your staff timetabling information, and then start to say, well, what's the impact on this in time-wise? If we're going to give someone time off, in a data warehouse, it's really easy to just pull it through and say, well, what's the cost per lesson? Once you've got your user stories, then it's time to think about the simplest things you can model. You can't create the entire data warehouse at once. So for instance, I think on that list, probably the easiest thing to model is this one, because it only requires a couple of dimensions and facts. Time is running against me, so I'm not going to go into that too much, but really you just need to know who are your students, who are your teachers, and dates get really weird in this process, but if you have a really good date table, oh my goodness, it makes things so much easier. And then you just need one set of facts, which is just every new behavior incident. That's not a huge amount of work. So you can do that as a first example with a team of working through how this data warehouse is going to look. And then once you're done, you can just keep iterating. So you can keep going back and saying, every time I pick up a new user story, let's go back and let's add in more things. One thing that works really well, that has to be essential, is absolutely essential to this process, is a data warehouse has to be just only ever adding things to, never taking away. So you do have to be quite careful about your design, because once you've written a column name, you can't ever change it, because if you change it, everything that uses that data warehouse is going to break. And one of your main purposes of creating this is to give consistency to other people. So in this process, we always say, I will add any column you like, I will add any table you like, but we're never going to take anything away. So these things can grow and grow over time. And if somebody comes along and says, actually, I'd really like to know a student's siblings, it's like, okay, easy to do. We'll just add an extra table that has that. But we never take anything away, because that way anything that relies on it isn't going to be removed. So that was a real whistle-stop tour. I think we've got about 2 minutes left, and I know that for a lot of people it's quite late in the evening. If anyone does have any questions, feel free to unmute and put them, or you can just put them in the chat. Just having a look through. Yeah, Ken. So yeah, definitely in terms of the leadership and sort of the groups around it, it's what we tend to have is we have data stewards. So we have someone that's in charge of maybe different tables in there. That's kind of a system that we're looking at. And they would be in charge of saying, right, we're going to add this column in. This is what we need. And yeah, and then they will work together with our IT team to look at our sort of extraction and transformation system. Okay, great. If you do have any questions or anything you want to contact me, I'm on Twitter while it still survives, or do feel free to send me an email. And yeah, thank you so much, Andy, as well, for organising this. I only caught the last half an hour or so, but it's been absolutely fantastic day. I'm really looking forward to seeing the recordings as well of all the sessions.
James, thank you very much. I don't need to post any more sessions in the chat. That is